Welcome everyone to the third Design Conversations lecture of the fall semester. This series is sponsored by the Vignelli Center for Design Studies and is underwritten by a generous alum, Chris Bailey of the Bailey Brand Consulting Group in Philadelphia. Today, to introduce our speaker, please welcome Professor Josh Owen.
Thanks, Roger. Welcome, everyone. Very exciting to have our distinguished lecturers come in each time they do. But there's a little bit of an extra pleasure that we experience when they happen to also be alums from RIT. So it's very exciting for us to bring in Evan after, I think he said 27 years was his last visit here when he was in many of your shoes. So it's been a while, but we're happy to welcome him home. Just a quick story before I introduce Evan's credentials, of which there are many. For years before I came to Rochester, I lived in Philadelphia and was on this wonderful board at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which is called CoLab. And this was constructed of a number of design professionals from around the Philadelphia community. And so I met some really impressive and interesting people, two of which, who sat next to me often, were the Snydermans. These were Evan's parents, who ran a prestigious gallery in Philadelphia. And they always brought immense conversation to the group, important dialogue and wonderful experience. And when I left Philly and took the job here in Rochester, they said, you really have to meet our son, because not only is he an impressive person, but he went to RIT where you're going now. And so I did, and I'm really thrilled that I have, because Evan's impressive work in his role in design culture has made quite a mark on the global scene, and wonderful to see him back here at RIT to share it with you all. So, a few words about Evan before we bring him to the stage. Evan is the owner and co-founder of R & Company, a gallery in New York dedicated to the promotion and preservation of 20th and 21st century design. Celebrating 20 years in business, R & Company is considered one of the most prominent and groundbreaking design galleries in the world, and contributed to creating a renewed global interest in collectible design through their research, exhibitions, and publications programs. The gallery represents some of the preeminent historical and contemporary figures in the design world, including our own Wendell Castle, the Haas Brothers, Greta Magnusson Grossman, Jeff Zimmerman, Joaquim Tenreiro, Katie Stout, and Rogan Greger. Since 1997, Snyderman has curated exhibitions, contributed to multiple publications, and lectured internationally on interior and industrial design history, as well as current maker trends for fairs and institutions, including SUNY Purchase, Parsons, the New School for Design, Design Miami, Basel, the Museum of Arts and Design in New York, the Museum of the City of New York, and the Aldrich Contemporary Art Museum. Prior to founding R & Company with partner Zesty Mayers, Snyderman was active member of the B Team, a nonprofit performance art group who traveled internationally, staging events and exhibitions based around live glass blowing. The B Team was the recipient of the Louis Comfort Tiffany Foundation grant, as well as a Bessie Award for Performance. Snyderman was born in Philadelphia, PA, in 1970, received his BFA from RIT in 92, and his MFA from the Tyler School of Art in 94. As a professional artist, he's received a Wheaton Fellowship in 95, a teaching position at Urban Glass in Brooklyn in the same year. Snyderman's artwork is included in the permanent collections of the Delaware Art Museum, the Corning Museum of Glass, and the Hadeland Glass Museum in Oslo, Norway. So I think we can all agree that Evan is a rather accomplished individual, and we're delighted to have you with us today. Evan, welcome.
thing on? Okay, hi. Well, thank you, Josh, for inviting me here, and it's nice to be back at RIT after a few years. Time passes very quickly. I'll let you guys know that now. You will see. But it is, I had a lot of great experiences here at RIT, and it's a great school. What I love about it is the combination of all the different departments that you have access to here, and you guys should use that to full advantage. That's one thing. We'll get through. Hopefully I don't bore you guys. I have a lot of images. I'm a visual person, went to art school, and became a businessman sort of a little bit by accident. But I'll start off with this, first slide, which really goes back. This is a historical image of a B-team performance. We're still good. And the B-team was something that grew out of university students. It started at Mass Art with a group of glassblowing students who basically wanted to sort of change the way people looked at object making. We were, in a way, sort of anti-object makers. And the reason I bring up the B team now is because it's still relevant to what we're doing as a gallery, which is that we never wanted to follow the herd. We never wanted to do the things that were expected of us. We wanted to challenge conventions as an artist and later on as a gallerist. So to kind of, in a way, make people think. And still today, that's one of our biggest goals, is to try to get people to think about what it is they're looking at, what it is they're talking about, what it is they're making. So this is an image from a B-team performance from 1997 in New York. And the B-team was really, we were all individual artists, but our goal was to have the glass be the star. So in a way, we were anonymous. We were sort of puppeteers to let the glass itself be the performer. And we established these very elaborate installations and site-specific performances to create sort of happenings. And in this image, you see us creating what we called a fear jar. So interacting with the audience was one of our important points. So we would actually gather up everyone's fears in the audience on a small piece of paper, and then stick it inside of a hot jar, seal it, and incinerate them. That was normally how we started the performances. So it got everyone, involved. I kept this slide in because I saw in the gallery right now, there's a photograph of someone doing exactly what we did a long time ago, which was trying to dance on hot glass with your feet on fire, which is a lot of fun. So, after moving to New York, the B team lasted for several years. Right now, the Corning Museum of Glass is in process of taking all the B team archives, so hopefully there'll be more to come about the history of the B team. The thing that we are involved in is what we call collectible design, for lack of a better term. And what that means, it's hard to describe. It's not really fully developed or defined at this point. We're still in this kind of early stages of what is happening with the crossover between the fine arts, the world of design, and craft. We exist as a gallery at the intersection of those three art forms, and it's our goal to promote them all and bring this to a much bigger audience. In the year 2004, there was a developer in Miami Beach named Craig Robbins who owned the whole neighborhood called the Design District. And he invited Zesty and I, my business partner, who was also part of the B team, by the way, to come down to Miami because he had this idea of trying to organize a design fair. We had at the same time been working on this idea internally and doing research looking at the art fairs around the world, and there was no design fair to complement them. And people were collecting art, but why aren't they collecting design in the same way? So we went down to Miami and met with this gentleman, and through those initial meetings developed what went on to become Design Miami. which has now really the key sort of platform, let's say, for the development of ideas for design, craft, art, all of these things that I'm talking about. So this is a slide from our first booth in Design Miami. And at this time, we were really still pretty much a historical design gallery, which is where we started selling classic 20th century design, although even at this time, we were interested in the sort of things that other people were not. So we started looking at Werner Panton, for instance, who was a Danish designer who lived in Switzerland, who made all these sort of pop art plastic pieces, which is what you see hanging here. We did this whole installation. Again, the idea of installation, maybe because of our art background, the work I did as an artist, has always been very important to us. Presentation is pretty much everything. Now, we're jumping ahead here quite a few years, but this is where we introduced the work of one of our contemporary artists, the Haas Brothers, at a fair in Basel, Switzerland. And this is essentially what they call the sex room. So this was designed as a room, and now this caused a little bit of controversy, this piece. Not for the reasons you would think, not because it's, you know, a vagina and like, you know, you have to enter it to see what's inside, but because the art dealers were upset that we were showing what they considered art in the design fair. That was interesting. That was what got us excited, that we were able to actually challenge what people thought of as design or art, and how can you define it anyways. Inside the room, it was really designed as a unique user room. One person was supposed to go in at a time. The Advocate for the Sexual Outsider was the title of the piece officially. The idea was that whether you were gay or straight and you entered this room, you could experience all aspects of sexuality without anyone judging you. That was the point of the piece. So the other thing that we do as a gallery is we try to engage institutions. So as a commercial dealer, working with institutions has always been a challenge. As a commercial gallery, museums are generally shy to work with you because in some way or other you may profit from the promotion of an artist. But in the end, what we believe is that we're all sort of engaged in the same goal, which is to make a bigger presence, a bigger audience for design. So this is a slide from my first museum show that I curated at the Stockholm Architecture Museum in Sweden, on the work of a Swedish architect, Greta Magnusson Grossman, who actually moved to Los Angeles in 1941 from Stockholm. And the Swedes had all but forgotten about her. But in fact, she was the first woman to receive an architecture degree in Sweden and had vast influence across all of Scandinavia and the US. We now own her archives and her estate, which is stored in our library in New York. But here you see just some early slides of this first museum show. This show then went on to travel to the Price Tower Art Center and eventually to the Pasadena Museum of Art. Another one of our museum shows was on Wendell Castle, who most of you guys probably know. I worked with Wendell for many years, actually. I guess maybe first meeting him when I was a student here. And really being interested in his work, the historical work was what I was most interested in. When I started my business selling 20th century design, I thought of Wendell and thought of all this great work I had seen when I visited him. But at this time, we're talking about around 2000 or 1999, Wendell wasn't as popular as he is again today. He didn't really have any gallery representation and was in a way doing his work as he always did. But I came up to visit Wendell, and again, Wendell was famous, wildly famous for his work in wood. But what people didn't know about Wendell was the work he did in plastics, which is what I related to, maybe because of my interest in design, you're interested in industrial design, you understand he was an industrial designer first, then a sculptor. So the idea of this plastic work was something I thought was really interesting because I was also interested in Italian design and all this great radical design you'll see later. Wendell was really the only American designer to explore this part of design here in this country. So years later, I curated a museum show on Wendell at the Aldrich Contemporary Art Museum. And again, this is an art museum. And this was the only, and still to date, design show they've ever done. So fitting Wendell into the canon of fine art was the goal. And to create that bigger conversation, a bigger audience around what he was doing. This is one of Wendell's most iconic pieces. It's called The Environment for Contemplation. And this piece was actually something that the first time I went to visit Wendell, we found in his retired kiln shed, buried underneath bricks with raccoons living in it. And it took some convincing to get Wendell to restore it, but he did after 6 months of work, and this piece made it back out into the light of day. It has since gone on to be in some major permanent collections and museum shows, and now it's in a very prominent permanent collection in New York. Here's some other shots of that early Castle show. Again, going back to the idea of presentation. Presentation is really everything. Photography is another thing that's so important. I can tell you guys, as students, as artists, as designers, photograph your work and photograph it well, because in the end, what people see is your photographs. Once you get outside the room of people that are there listening to you tell them your story, the images are so critical to how people perceive your work. So one of the things we have in the galleries, we have an in-house photographer. We have a full-time photographer on staff in a photo studio so that we can control all the images that we put out there into the world. The other big thing I think that is important to discuss is collaboration. So collaboration is something that we've really built our business around. If we were only interested in our own point of view, we would be very much, we'd be nowhere. Without other people's ideas, without other people's input, it's incredible what happens when you open that door. So one of the things we do at the gallery is we invite a guest curator every year to come in and reinterpret the space. So again, these are all installations done at the Franklin Street Gallery in Tribeca. This was a collaboration with Michael Reynolds, who is a photographer and stylist. Sometimes we work with architects, sometimes designers, sometimes artists, sometimes stylists. We're not married to any one way of collaboration. So we're constantly looking for new ways to explore and to build relationships that way. This is with another interior designer, Kelly Behan. And transforming the space, each time you come to the gallery, you'll see it's completely different. And that's one of the things that sets us apart from most other galleries, is that we invest a great deal into the way we present things and to build context around the story we're trying to tell. This is an exhibition we did with an architect named Kulepat Yantrasast. Kulepat is a Taiwanese architect who worked with Tato Ando for 10 years. He's since become a very well-known architect in the art world. He's done lots of museums. He did the Speed Art Museum, the Marciano Brothers Foundation in Los Angeles, the David Gordansky Gallery, the Gagosian Gallery, and he recently designed our new gallery that we just opened. But again, this was a study of materials, and he broke down basically all of the materials you use in furniture making and design to their raw elements, and created this grid throughout the entire space. And through the whole space were these little hand-drawn stories on the wall. and again, it goes back to the idea of storytelling, which is something that we couldn't exist without. Now, another collaboration we did was with a designer, not a designer, I guess Jim Walrod is more of a collector. And difficult design was something that we've always been interested in. The idea of difficult design is things that were, I guess, challenging when they were originally introduced, maybe out failures, but then went on to become sort of iconic objects in the world of design. So there's the Garrett Riefeld chair, which of course is very famous, but at the time of its introduction, people lambasted this piece in the press. It was shot down by every manufacturer for the first several years of him trying to put this piece into production. Similarly with people like Werner Panton I mentioned earlier, and even Wendell Castle with his work in plastic. It was a total failure. He didn't sell a single piece in his first show. But then these pieces went on to become iconic. So perseverance maybe is the story in the end. But the idea of challenging maybe what exists in the world, whether it's successful at first, doesn't really matter. If you're true and you believe in what you're doing, it will go on, it will live on. This is another collaboration with an architect in New York named Tony Ingrau. Again, each show we do, we try to create images that can represent the exhibition. So this is an example of the creative direction that I do inside the gallery, where we create images that will represent what that show, what the show actually looks like. So this was done in the studio, not inside the gallery. But we document every project we do in this way. Now, this is another installation by a French architect, Pierre Yovanovitch, who I'll show later some additional slides because his show is up currently in the gallery. But Pierre is an incredible interior designer, maybe one of the most important interior designers in the world right now. And each generation, there's maybe one person that comes out of the interior design world on this level, like a Peter Marino or Jacques Grange from Paris and these people. But Pierre is one who's unique in that he's working with these small ateliers across France, trying to preserve the sort of history of the decorative arts of France in particular, which has the long history of this kind of craft. And another example of installation, and this was another collaborative project we did with an Italian carpet producer. So as we've developed the gallery's program over time, we've gone on to represent contemporary artists. So starting in historical design, we're now more or less 50-50 contemporary design and historical design. And one of the things we try to do with the contemporary designers is build, we create a market for their work, starting with exhibitions from small objects and creating opportunities for them. So this was an opportunity that was brought to me by way of a carpet producer who has a massive business in Italy producing carpets for like Walt Disney Studios and very inexpensive carpets. But they wanted to do a boutique project with artists. So they came to us and I curated a collection of carpets with 10 artists who had never made carpets before. And we then exhibited this body of work at the Venice Biennale, I guess 4 years ago. Or the last Biennale, whenever that was, 2.5 years ago. So putting together this body of work, now these two pieces here are by a woman named Dana Barnes, a New York textile artist, where she took existing kilns, these are like 100-year-old carpets from Iran, and then created these kind of felt paintings on top of them, which were extraordinary abstract expressionist paintings essentially. And then of course in this kind of setting, in a palazzo in Venice, which was extraordinary. And this project got incredible amounts of attention. Again, showing design in the context of the art world, that's one of the things we try to do as often as we can. Now, these two carpets are actually by Wendell Castle, which are very unusual. They're only few carpets he's ever made. They're unique pieces. And they're based on paintings he's done, which we don't see too many paintings by Wendell, but. And in the context of historical design, over the years, we've become, I guess, very specialized. So when we started, we were selling mid-century design, but over the last 20 years, we've become very focused on specific aspects of design. And we landed in Brazil about 18 years ago. We were invited to Brazil by way of an artist friend who was living there, who was a painter and sculptor, who said to us, you know, there's unbelievable design down here in Brazil that I don't think anyone's ever seen. And we got on a plane and we flew to Rio and discovered this incredible history of modern design in Brazil that essentially no one had really known, because Brazil was, you know, the borders of Brazil were closed to export for about 50 years. And that's part of the reason why it never left Brazil. The only thing exported from Brazil between 1950 and 1980 was music. But also Brazil is an incredibly large continent with, you know, a massive population, so it was very self-sufficient. But what happened in Brazil was that because of the resources there of this incredible material and craftsmen that were there, as well as very sophisticated clientele and wealthy clients, this incredible body of work was produced, which we've spent the last 18 years sort of digging out and uncovering. And now Brazilian design has become very well known, and there's galleries all over the world specializing in Brazilian design, which is fantastic. That's the dream come true, because we never want it to be about us, or we can never be the only ones. Once it grows beyond our gallery, then we've succeeded in what we're trying to do, which is to get this bigger conversation around design done. Now, this is just a slide of various designers from Brazil, all dating from the late 50s or early 50s through the late 60s, I'd say. Another image, this is by Sergio Rodriguez. And these are 3 works by Oscar Niemeyer. So Oscar Niemeyer is really maybe one of the few that people would have known outside of Brazil, because Oscar Niemeyer was a very famous architect. And he left Brazil. He lived in Paris. He moved away from Brazil to get away from he was a communist, hardcore communist. So he left Brazil and ended up in Paris for most of his career. It wasn't until the end of his life he went back to Brazil and finished out a lot of his unbuilt projects in the last like 15 to 20 years. He died about 7 or 8 years ago at 102 years old. His architectural projects range from you know, he was involved in the building and designing of the United Nations building in New York City, and built all of Brasilia. If you guys have seen photographs of Brasilia, it's the only sort of utopian vision of a city that was actually constructed. And then Italian radical design. So that's another one of our specialties. And I've spent the last, let's say, 8 or so years traveling around Italy, talking to all of the Italian architects who were involved in this movement, which started in the late 60s and was maybe one of the last great movements of design that grew out of political unrest. So again, design had a bigger story. It had a purpose beyond the functionality of the object. There was an actual meaning behind the objects, be it political or social, and I'm fascinated with that idea. Again, the story is still unfolding, and a lot of these architects and designers are still living, so we spent years trying to capture their stories. And actually we produced a documentary film called Super Design. And that film has traveled all over the world documenting this history. And it includes, archival footage and original interviews, and it's actually a pretty exciting, interesting film. Because the Italian radical designers weren't just interested in one thing, and maybe that's partly what I was drawn to. They were architects, but they couldn't find work as architects, so they decided to make furniture because it was accessible. But they also designed fashion, they made music, they did performance art, they did installation art. So it was this sort of idea of all the arts coming together. This is part of that Super Design exhibition. This is again in the gallery. So building an installation to show objects, to put them in context. This is another shot from that same installation. This is the Capitello, which is a massive chair made out of foam, designed in 1971. And the idea is that obviously it looks like an ancient ruin, but it was actually more of a political statement because the architects at this time, couldn't find work. And the only work that there was in Italy was this sort of restoration of classical architecture. Everyone was obsessed with this sort of Roman architecture. So here they are making a chair, and the idea of you sort of putting your ass on the top of classical architecture was the statement behind the piece. And these pieces were produced, but in very small numbers. So in the end, a lot of these works are very ephemeral. They're made out of foam that has not survived, and people are now trying to figure out how to preserve them because they're very important documents to the sort of history of design. And we showed in this exhibition original drawings from that architect. So now we're going to show a little bit of the contemporary program. This is one of the artists we represented for many years, named David Wiseman. So now when we get into the contemporary program, the artists that we choose to represent, or that we've somehow grown to represent, are people who are, again, doing something a little bit different than your traditional designer. David, for instance, is a craftsperson. He works in plaster and bronze, very much rooted in the sort of decorative arts of 100 years ago. Runs a small studio in Los Angeles. Everything is done by hand. Every single piece is unique. These are cast bronze gates and plaster walls. And we constructed this all inside the gallery for his first solo show with us. This is an example of one of his objects. This is a cake tray. So this is cast bronze. Again, a unique piece with hand-blown glass. And then this is Thaddeus Wolfe, who's another contemporary glassmaker. Now, Thaddeus is interesting because he's using glass in a way that it's hard to make something in glass that you've never seen before. Those of you who work in glass will know that. What Thaddeus does is he blows glass into molds, but makes the glass do things it doesn't want to do, like make sharp corners and edges. And then he goes in afterwards and carves it up with tools and chops through layers to reveal other things. Very architectural, brutalist almost, some people say, but really powerful pieces. He does do, or at least he used to do, a lot of lighting. He's not doing so much lighting anymore. These are all illuminated objects. But that's a big part of our program, is also lighting. So lighting is one of the bridges I find easiest to cross into sort of sculpture and art. We found that the designers we represent that do lighting, those lamps, those illuminated sculptures, tend to, you have space when you make a light. So imagine you have this room. There's lots of stuff on the walls, but there's nothing hanging in the middle. So it opens up an opportunity. We're always looking for opportunities of, to fill space with the objects the designers are creating. So lighting is something that, fills that gap really well, and it's very much something you can play with and really experiment with, because you don't have to sit on it. It's generally out of reach for most people, so artists can have a little bit more freedom. It does have to work. You can't burn someone's house down. So there are some technical aspects to it you have to, pay attention to. And the other thing is objects. We sell a lot of objects. So I'm constantly encouraging all the designers to make objects. Even if you're a furniture designer or you're a lighting designer, objects are sort of like an entry into a marketplace. Like a print, if you were a painter or an illustrator. Because they're accessible in scale, collectors can buy them and own them. So we do a lot of object making. Now this is all the work of one artist named Jeff Zimmerman. Jeff was also a member of the B team. And Jeff has gone on to become our biggest selling artist, actually, although he's very much under the radar. Most people don't know Jeff's work. Every one of his projects is site specific. They're mostly commission based, but these chandeliers can grow from 6 feet to like 35 feet. And another one of our artists is the Haas Brothers. We met the Haas Brothers about 8 years ago when they were just starting out. They hadn't really made anything yet. And these guys have gone on to become probably one of the most well-known young contemporary designers in America at the moment. They work in, again, ceramics, they work in wood, they do painting, sculpture, bronze, they make music, they design fashion. They're, again, doing everything. But somehow, they're able to develop new processes in materials, and this is what makes them so unique. They're twin brothers, but they're total opposites of one another. One, Nikki, is more of the sculptor, and Simon is like the scientist. Simon does all the material studies, developing this whole series. This is called the Accretion. And this series started with them basically not knowing how to make ceramics. And by accident, discovering a sort of technique by doing it wrong. So they started with this body of a clay body, and they were trying to apply slip to the surface, but it wasn't dry. It was still green, so it beaded up on the surface. And then they let that dry, and then they applied this slip to those beaded surfaces. And eventually, over the course of a year and a half of development, created sort of like hair on these works. Now these have gone on to become giant sculptures, and are found in collections all over the world. The Metropolitan Museum of Art acquired a piece from us last year. There's work in lots of museums. And then this is one of their furniture pieces. Now they like to have fun with their work. And most of the people we represent, I like to work with people who have fun. I want to have fun. Fun is important. You guys should enjoy what you do. If you don't enjoy what you do, then why are you doing it? But so they started this whole series called Beasts, and all came out of a trip to Iceland, and they saw these sheep, like Icelandic sheep, hanging out in the field, and bought a few hides back from their trip, and decided to start making these furry beasts, a little bit kind of out of their childhood memories of like where the wild things are. And in the end, this series turned into a very successful group, and they started making, now they make mini beasts and micro beasts, and every single one of them is unique, and they're generally, you know, these are all titled works, so they're making furniture, but really it's a work of sculpture. You can sit on it, but it also stands alone as a work of art. Now, we traveled to Africa with them several years ago. We went to Cape Town. We were invited to Cape Town to participate in something called the Design World Capital event. And we were asked, it was sort of like a World's Fair for design, and we were asked to represent contemporary design in America at this fair. And we brought several of our artists with us, the Haas Brothers, Jeff Zimmerman, David Wiseman, all together. We went to Africa. And while there, we discovered there was like a local craft fair happening design fair. And separately, we all visited this fair and all came back with these same objects. We all bought objects from this same vendor at this fair, which was these beaded animals, which turns out that these beaded animals are done by this group of women that live in the townships outside of Cape Town. So, you know, Cape Town is not a perfect place. There's a lot of things, you know, apartheid might be gone, but things haven't really changed. We discovered these women are making these objects in their houses in Khayelitsha, which is the township outside of Cape Town. And they get paid a couple of dollars per object, and they're sold by this nonprofit, which is a good idea. It's a good cause. But the Haas Brothers became very intrigued with this material itself, these glass beads, and brought the idea, this again, over a year-long process from the first time we went there to actually making anything. We made several trips back and forth, but started a collaboration with these women to produce their work in beads, but they also didn't want to just hire these women to do beaded sculptures for them. They wanted these women to be involved in the process. So they actually asked them to sort of become co-authors of the work. And the Haas Brothers then gave the empowerment of the design process to the Haas sisters, which they now call themselves. And they co-produced this whole body of work, which then went on to be shown at the Cooper Hewitt Design Museum in New York. And for that exhibition, we brought 5 of the women to New York, and they got to, you know, experience New York City in a completely incredible way, and then go back to Khayelitsha, and in the end, it really created what was a community. We didn't really, before this project, these women had never worked as in teams. They always worked individually, but to make work on this scale, they had to work together, and so they had to rent a space, and they could bead these bigger objects together, which all of a sudden they realized they had a community that they didn't know they had. This community has now grown, and there's about over 100 women working on these pieces, and the project continues. There was just a huge exhibition last month, or in September, of these large-scale sculptures. So this project hopefully will be sustainable and will continue down the road. This is the original group of Freaks, which is what the series was called. And most of them are named after specific like people or pop culture. A lot of the Haas work comes from pop culture. So there's Taylor Spliff and Al Gorilla, and you know, there's always something funny in their titles. And then another one of our contemporary artists is a person named Rogan Greger, who came out of fashion. He was a fashion designer. And Rogan is doing this incredible lighting. Again, every piece is unique, working with materials like plaster and found quartz and rocks and carving these objects directly by hand. This is actually a large installation. We're going to be showing this work in Miami coming up in December. He's creating a whole sort of room, including a large fireplace. So within the context of our booth, we're building this entire kind of Rogan Greger installation. Katie Stout. This is another one of our young artists, Katie Stout, who this was our booth in Miami last year. So Katie works in ceramics. She also works in bronze. She's also worked in fashion. But this was a series of these sort of, they're lamps, life-size naked lady lamps. And they're not meant to be sexual in any way. They're really actually more about sort of the empowerment of women. And these are based on the statues where you see in architecture, I don't know the name of it, where you have the figure holding up the sort of top of the column, you know, the power of holding up that's what these women are doing. They're holding a lampshade, of course, but that's the idea. And these are life-size. These are some table lamp versions of these. But this was our booth in Miami last year, and there was, 5, 6, 7 lamps. And within the first 10 minutes of the fair, we had sold all of them. And they went to unbelievable collections, to the head of the board of trustees at the Guggenheim, to like these really important collections. So again, this is taking a chance. When first people see these, they think, what the hell is that? Like, you know, or they think it's just somehow silly. But there's a real message, and that message translates, and it might be silly, and that's all right. But again, there's something else happening here, right? It makes you think. It creates emotion. That's the goal. We're working on a new project with Katie. She just came back from a residency in Milan, and she's working on a whole series of these cast bronze large-scale cabinets that are going to be for her next solo show. So we connected her with a foundry in Italy, which was one of the oldest foundries in Milan. And they're doing this whole insane set of unique cabinets with ceramic and bronze. So again, like really pushing the boundaries of what's possible with the material. And this is a new artist. This is Serban Ionescu, who we just started to represent, who's a Romanian architect who works in steel. So a year and a half ago, we moved into a new space, 1 block away from our original gallery. And the new space, the reason we had outgrown our original gallery, we now have 30 or so people on staff. And we needed a space to be able to give the artists more room to grow. And this is really set up more like almost like a museum. We do these very large-scale exhibitions in the space, but still continuing the idea of the collaboration and the sort of discovery. But one of the key aspects of the new space is the library. So along the way, we've been collecting rare books on design and also archives. So we own several estates, and we own the archives of several designers, or parts of the archives of several designers that we've worked with over the years, historical design in particular. And so all of that material is now stored. We have a dedicated floor to library and archives, and it's open to the public. So anyone can make an appointment if they want to come to the gallery and do research. We have a full-time archivist on staff, and she runs the archive. She does her own programming. And we have an archive wall where we always have an exhibition of works from the archives on view that generally will relate to one of the exhibitions in the gallery. This is some of the archives from Greta Magnusson Grossman, whose estate we own, and showing just some of our original photography, color samples, books, magazines, ephemera. And we get at least 2 to 3 tours a week from students, curators, writers doing research, coming through the gallery and using the archive, which is fantastic. So next time any of you guys are in New York and you want to come visit, you're welcome. This is a drawing of Wendell's we have in the archive, of one of his most iconic pieces, the music rack. And I mentioned before, we do have a large investment in publishing. So we publish our own books. We've published 21 books over the last 20 years or so, and some with different publishers, but the idea of the books is that these are the things that will survive or, you know, capture the story that we're trying to tell, and hopefully live on long beyond the gallery. So this is sort of, in a way, creating a little bit of a legacy, but also these are really books for learning, for tools, and on subjects that have not been explored. So again, super design, Brazilian modern design. We did the book on Wendell Castle in 2012, Wandering Forms, and Jose Zanini Caldas, which is a brand new book as well. Now, so more recently, in the September of this year, going back to the idea of collaboration and tying together all of this idea of the design world and the art world, we invited a young curator in New York named Raquel Carey to curate a chair show for us at the gallery. So as a design dealer, I never wanted to do a chair show because it seemed too obvious in a way. I mean, there's been hundreds of chair shows throughout the history of, you know, design, I guess. We have dozens of books on our shelf about the history of the chair, and how could we possibly do that better than what other museums have done. So the idea we brought to, actually the curator brought the idea to us, sorry. Raquel brought the idea to us, which was to not invite the typical designers or to show famous pieces of design or chairs, but to ask conceptual artists to make a chair, or to show work that artists had made that maybe revolved around the idea of what a chair represented. So this exhibition had 50 artists in it, massive undertaking. But in this show we had, the idea was that it broke down this kind of hierarchy, because of course there were designers also included. So the idea of the artists and the designers being on equal footing was the concept behind the show. And we had very famous artists like Urs Fischer and Nate Lohman and Rob Pruitt, like really major contemporary artists, showing alongside students who just graduated RISD to people you've never heard of. And there were no labels on any of the pieces, so it was completely democratic in how the show, there was no pride of placement. And the show was a huge success. In the back here, this is a Campagna Brothers and Cause collaboration. And on the right-hand side, that's a Katie Stout chair, and Martino Gamper, who I think is a fantastic person also doing this, who's like a crossover between showing in art galleries and also in design galleries. And this is an installation, you can see this is our new gallery. So the new gallery, I don't have so many shots of it, but we have a 40-foot atrium. So we can really scale up. We can show work on a massive scale. We have a crane that we installed inside. So the idea is that there's no more limits to what the physical space can offer. And then in the same space, which is hard to recognize, we just opened this show on Tuesday last week. Pierre Jovanovic, who again, we did the show 2 years ago. So now Pierre has taken his idea of an installation to a new level. And he built essentially like a 5-room apartment in the gallery. So this is the living room which you enter, and complete with like ceramic fireplace. This is the dining room. We installed curtains on all the walls. This is the sort of foyer where you enter the gallery, and then the bedroom at the back. So again, going to great lengths to kind of put the work in context. You know, in the end, most of these things, although they might be for sale, are really site-specific, built in, like the fireplace. The idea is to tell the story of Pierre Jovanovic and have his career grow beyond the exhibition itself. So it normally takes us 2 to 3 years to sort of recoup what we invest in an exhibition. So it's a long-term investment for us when we represent a designer or an artist, which does limit the number of people we can represent, unfortunately, because it does take a lot of effort to do it right. Now, Wendell, back to Wendell. I'll end with Wendell because we're doing a show in January at the gallery, which will be the first time we've done a show in about 8 years. And the show that we're doing with Wendell coming up is a Masterworks show, works we've collected for many years that we've never exhibited. These are all historical works from the 60s and 70s. This is one of his most iconic pieces that hasn't seen the light of day in over 30 years. But we're showing Wendell alongside some of his, the artists that inspired him. So the idea is to put him in context with other iconic artists. Wendell was very much inspired by sort of traditional sculptors like Brancusi and Isamu Noguchi, Henry Moore, Alexander Calder. So we're showing work, we're borrowing work from several different institutions. We're borrowing Noguchi sculptures from the Noguchi Foundation. We have work coming from Hauser and Wirth Gallery of Henry Moore and Jean Arc. And hopefully we're trying to get a Calder from the Calder Foundation. So to put Wendell into this sort of context of a larger world, a larger story, is the goal with that exhibition. So that'll be an exciting show. And we're publishing a book, another book on him as well. And last slide, you guys are still with me, is a show we're doing next fall. And this show is sort of the revisiting of Objects USA. Now, Objects USA was an exhibition that took place in 1969. Johnson Wax sponsored it. It traveled all over the country, and it was the first survey of American studio craft. So this show included, you know, all the famous artists like Peter Voulkos you see here. Wendell was in the show. Major people from every medium. And it was the first time people had seen this kind of work, and it traveled, like I said, all over the country. So this is the 50th anniversary of this exhibition. We're doing a massive show revisiting the original exhibition with 50 of the original artists, but then we're also doing 50 contemporary artists. So Objects USA 2020 will be the title of the show, and the idea is that this will now launch a biannual for contemporary design that we're going to continue on for the future. So going forward, we will no longer do the historical review. It will just be contemporary design biannual, which surprisingly doesn't really exist in this country. There's no design biannual. So hopefully we're going to found this new project that's a big undertaking, but it will be exciting for you guys to see and maybe even take part of in the future. So I think that's all I have to say for now. Anyone have any questions? Yeah. What kind of path? So, interesting. I don't know industrial design and art direction. I mean, essentially, you know, those two things can fall into so many different, you know, uses, I guess, or job titles. I mean, creative direction is so broad, for one. I think that gives you access to a lot of different things. Industrial design is something that, you know, Josh and I have talked a lot about. It's, you know, right now I'm trying to figure out how all these worlds come together. You know, industrial design is, like all these mediums, you know, it's a challenge to find work as an industrial designer, but how you present yourself, you know, put yourself out there, try to meet as many people as you can, go to as many fairs and exhibitions as you can. I mean, there's no clear path to success in any of this. You just have to go out there and do it, honestly. Yeah. Anyone else? Well, yeah.
I'm wondering, so you started off the lecture with your slides.
Yeah.
And the B team was has this myth in the glass world of sort of the naughty kids.
Mm-hmm.
Breaking a lot of rules and making a mess, potentially putting themselves and their audience in danger, for making them feel that way.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if you agree with that myth, and if you think that any of that energy has influenced your career as a, I don't even know how to categorize it, but all the things you just talked about.
100%. The B team approach is with us in everything we do, even in the way we're constantly trying to kind of shake the tree and push the boundaries with the artists we represent. I mean, maybe it's been toned down a little bit, but the ethos is still there, the idea, the energy, the drive to continue to do something different and to not follow the rules. We base everything around that. The idea is if you have an idea, you just go out and do it. Like if you don't ask, it's a no. That's always been our way of approaching every project. So the B team did that. You know, we created these insane performances, and yes, they were dangerous, but no one was ever hurt. And it's a little bit less dangerous what we do now, but we're playing also a much bigger role, and hopefully having a bigger influence on what we can do in the world of design. So kind of continuing the same conversation. And it's funny, when we look back through the notebooks from the B team and the things we were writing about and the things we were talking about are exactly the same things we write and talk about today, which is pretty cool. Yeah. Okay.
So I saw a lot of art and I saw a lot of design.
Yeah.
And we talked about them kind of interchangeably.
Yeah.
So what's the difference?
So I get that question a lot, and I don't know the answer, or if there is an answer. You know, our goal is to sort of break down those barriers between what people consider art and what people consider design. An easy answer is that, you know, art goes on the wall, and you're not supposed to touch it. Design is meant to be touched. You have a different relationship with design objects than you do with art objects. So that's a simple, pragmatic answer. But the whole thing is so gray and it's all mixed up that there's really no way to tell the difference. And in the end, it's up to the viewer or the collector or the patron to label it what they want. So, you know, a lot of my clients buy a Katie Stout Naked Lady, and that's a piece of art. They call that sculpture. Whereas others might call it a lamp. It's up to you to decide. It's just a label in the end, right? And there weren't so many labels in the past, and maybe that's what's happened over the last 50 years as things have become sort of like divided up into boxes of what things are. And hopefully we can get away from all that and try to, like, I see all the worlds coming back together now, which is what we're really, really pushing to try to get at, is this, you know, moment where all the worlds are colliding. And from that, it's something exciting. So we're at a really interesting moment in this movement where opportunities are endless because there are no real rules. You can do whatever you want. Yeah.
Maybe this is not an easy question to answer, but when I look at the scope of your work, I sort of in my head categorize it as the historical stuff where you're looking to find kind of unpicked stories, untold stories, and then on the other side you're looking to, well, in a way, also tell untold stories with new artists and designers who haven't been maybe given a platform. So I guess my question, just sort of a challenging one, is well, how do you find those untold stories, both the historical ones and the new ones? Where are you looking? Just where you can speak to that.
Well, I mean, with the historical, we've sort of always, you know, I guess followed our, you know, intuition a little bit, and just tried to avoid the obvious. So when we started in the very early days of our business, you know, we were doing the flea market at 26th Street in Chelsea. We started with like a, you know, flea market table. And at that time we had a friend who was a Swedish glassblower, because we were still glassblowers. We were working every day as glassblowers and then doing the flea market on the weekends. And he said, you should come to Scandinavia, you know, you should come to Denmark. There's all this great design stuff there. So we immediately got on a plane, went to Denmark, and within, you know, a few weeks we were shipping containers of Danish modern furniture back to New York. And arriving at the flea market with like truckloads of Hans Wegner and Arne Jacobsen and all these famous things that we were pulling out of like thrift stores. So, but then everyone else started to go to Scandinavia, and then we went to Holland. So we always tried to kind of keep moving in the historical way, discovering all these great Dutch design from the 50s and 60s. And then we went to Germany, and then we landed in Brazil, and then that's kept us busy ever since. With contemporary design, though, it's always a challenge because we do get a lot of emails, as you would imagine, from young designers who, we try to answer all of them that we can. But generally, all the people and the talent that we've come to represent have come by way of recommendation for the most part, where we have a friend who says, oh, you should see this person. Or most of them have come simply that way. Or we're out there looking for certain things. I travel a lot, constantly traveling, and we do a lot of shows around the world, so we see a lot of things. And it's not specific to, we're not looking for any one thing. That's not going to give you like the answer of like what it is we look for in an artist, because there's no real answer. It's never one thing. We're not tied to a particular style or idea. It's like a package. There has to be an idea, there has to be a story, the work has to be interesting. You may or may not like it. I mean, I don't actually love everything we sell necessarily, but it has to have something that holds up. It stands up for itself in one reason or another. And it's never been just about my opinion, because if it was, it's pretty limiting. Cool. Well, it's good to be back here at RIT.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.